Well, we move on at this time to the program of the lecture, tonight's lecture. It is truly an honor to introduce to you tonight's speaker, whom I first encountered last summer at the Parliament of World Religions in Barcelona. Among a plethora of outstanding conferences, seminars, and speakers, in his sessions, Dr. Ashok Gangadin stood out as one of the most cutting-edge, forward-thinking, and radiant presenters. I was delighted to discover that he actually lived down the road and contacted him. He expressed curiosity about Swedenborg, whom he knew of, but had never deeply studied. After receiving and perusing some of our publications, he found himself genuinely interested in Swedenborg's thinking, viewing him as a visionary centuries ahead of his own time. After conversing with Dr. Gangadin, I felt certain he would make a delightful guest speaker at our annual meeting. Dr. Ashok Gangadin is a professor of philosophy at Haverford College, where he has taught for the last 35 years. He was the first director of the Margaret Guest Center for Cross-Cultural Study of Religion there, and has participated in numerous professional conferences on interreligious dialogue and East-West comparative philosophy. His primary concern throughout his career has been to clarify the universal logos, or common ground at the heart of human reason and rational life. He is founder-director of the Global Dialogue Institute, which seeks to embody the dialogical powers of global reason in all aspects of cultural life. In his many published essays, he has attempted to demonstrate that human reason is essentially global, dialogical, holistic, and intercultural. Dr. Gangadin has appeared on NBC News, in interviews for CNN Headline News in the Philadelphia region, and appeared last year in the national television series Thinking Aloud with Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. These two interviews with Mishlove on his forthcoming book, The Awakening of the Global Mind, continues to air in repeating cycles on the national scene. More recently, he was featured in the forthcoming series A Parliament of Minds, which arose from the 1988 World Congress of Philosophy, at which Dr. Gangadin helped convene and inaugurate the newly formed World Commission on Global Consciousness and Spirituality. He appears in a half-hour interview on his work and participated in a one-hour dialogue with Karan Singh, Robert Mueller, and Ewart Cousins. He has also agreed to host a forthcoming television series on patterns of the universe, bridging science and spirituality. Ashok became the host of Philly Live, your international connection, on WYBE Public Television, which is now called Global Lens. And he recently formed his Awakening Productions to begin work on producing a 6-part series for television on the narrative of his forthcoming book, The Awakening of the Global Mind. Another work of his has been accepted for publication by SUNY Press, Meditations on Global First Philosophy, The Quest for the Missing Grammar of Logos. Please join me in a warm welcome of Dr. Ashok Gangadin.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for that very warm and gracious. I could have listened all night. And what I'd like to do is, as Deborah pointed out, can you hear me in the back? I'm new to really serious encounter with Annual Swedenborg. And he's always been on the back burner. I'm a philosopher, as she pointed out. I've been teaching at Haverford actually 37 years. And I trained as a logician and ontologist. An ontologist is a philosopher who focuses on the way reality is shaped and the world views, and it's really the investigation of reality. The science of reality is ontology, and logic is the science of consciousness. Those are my two special areas. I was trained in the European tradition of philosophy. I was born in Trinidad and grew up in New York City. Came here as a boy. My family is from India. I didn't go to India until I came to Haverford in 1971 for the first time, and I'll mention that later because in a way what I'd like to do is to weave a story tonight about my journey and how in my 4 decades, 40 years of research on trying to answer a fundamental issue in the human condition that has not yet been adequately addressed and is absolutely vital for our sustainability on the planet at this time. And from that background, which I call opening the global mind, the global lens, which is to suggest that if you look at the great traditions, if we step back, most of us look at reality from our cultural lens. We're all raised in a certain perspective. Our culture provides a mental lens, and through that lens we interpret reality. All humans are interpreting beings. That's what we do. No one can get outside of that. And we interpret from our perspective. And most of us are never even aware that we have a lens. We don't step back from it and say, oh, this is my lens, and there are other lenses, and I can morph my mind into other ways of thinking, as you do when you cross a different culture or go into a different religious world. We generally are illiterate about that. We don't know how to do that. And in our finest moments you can. We can be raised in a Christian world and understand that vocabulary and believe that Jesus is the ultimate truth and that the biblical world is the true world. And yet, in our best moments, perhaps we can enter into the Hindu world, which has a profoundly different mental lens, a different ecology of mind. The mindscape of the person raised in the Hindu culture is completely organized in a different way. And the way you see reality and every other world from that lens is profoundly different from the Christian world. If you enter the Chinese mind and understood the Confucian way of understanding the world, or the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, that's still a different world. It's a different mind, a mindset, paradigm. There are many words for that. And yet we don't know how to cross worlds. And when I entered research 40 years ago as a young philosopher doing ontology, the study of reality, and saw right away that there are many different alternative worlds, many different narratives of reality. Science sees it one way and tells us what is real. Common sense presents it another way. And by the way, common sense already has multiple worlds. I'll talk about that in a moment. I'm still trying to just frame the space in which I'd like to encounter Swedenborg as I'm encountering him now. And I'd like to invite your help, because everything, I'm reading the books avidly since Jonathan and Deborah brought it to my attention. It's always been in the background. But since that television show and having the books and having to get into it, I was stunned and amazed that what I discovered as a philosopher in trying to open this global mind, this global space, a higher dimension of consciousness and language and experience, which has a profound logic. I call it the logos, the logic of logos, which is the future of the planet. And if you look back over millennia, all of the great minds of the traditions, East, West, North, and South, were all moving into that space, hinting at it, and more than hinting at it. Jesus was actually moving into that and embodying that. Right? And so when I read Swedenborg, any text I would open, I would find utterances and a voice that resonated at this higher level. I recognized what he was saying. He was speaking the logic. So I began to be fascinated, because my work as a philosopher in writing this Awakening of the Global Mind, this book, what I'm trying to do is to show that if we get out of our cultural lens, whether it's Chinese, certain African views, indigenous, Native American, American, whatever it may be, and take a global perspective, we can do that. To step back and to understand and be multilingual in our ontology, in our deep ontology, to go into this deeper space, and to understand the Buddhist perspective, the Hindu perspective, the Zen perspective, the African indigenous perspectives, and so forth. And at the same time, you don't have to shut one down in order that we could reach a point of interperspectivity. That's a global lens. It's a monumental advance for human beings who have been trained to look at reality through a particular localized lens. It's a profound shift to being a new kind of being, to rise into an interperspectival, into what I call the logos. I use a Greek word for that. And all of the great traditions were naming the logos differently. I choose the word logos rather than Om or Tao or Allah or Yahweh or any of those, because I'm a scientist and logician. And the word logos of the Greek philosophy is the word logic, it's speech, it's word. It is mind. It's a rich word, the logos. And it has a very, very illustrious tradition. And so I felt, as a scientist, philosopher, logician, to use that word, but in a particular way, which I'm going to suggest in a moment, that because they're two profoundly different levels and technologies of thinking. And it's my judgment at this point, and this is again where I want your help, since I assume that many of you are saturated in Swedenborg's life and writings all your life, and you would know the text much better than I. and to test out my intuition, that is Swedenborg speaking from this deeper space? And can we make sense of it from that? I'd like your help and collaboration on that. In a way, what I'm going to do, and I have a sketch pad here, can you all see it?
We got the podium out of your way.
Well, thank you, that will help. And I can move this out a little better. How is that? Is that better? Is that okay for everyone? Okay? I'm going to give you some visualization. This is to accelerate things. And that when you step back from, most of us are raised in a certain lens. That's a space in which philosophers, say Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, who opened up the science of logic, saw that to think is to predicate. I don't want to get technical tonight. I just want to give you some pictures because I'm not going to talk very long. We're talking about 45 to 50 minutes and then open conversation. Okay? So I've got to cover 3,000 years. Now, this space is a space of thinking. To think is to predicate. Okay, very briefly. Which means that we take concepts and put them, weave them together in a particular way. And our culture teaches how to. Pen is blue. Socrates is a man. Right? Rain is fall. Whatever it is, we have certain things we talk about and we join them. Right? And we don't even realize that when we learn our cultural grammar, our cultural language, right, at this deeper level of logic, we're learning how to put things together to make sense and meaning. This is where we make meaning, and it pictures our world. And if we start to do an experiment and say, okay, how do I predicate my world? What is my world like? And what would it be like to cross into a different world, a different grammar, that puts the world together differently? You begin to play with that, and you see how quickly you realize, wow, we've learned a particular way to think. If I say the stone is hard, that's fine. If I say 7 is blue, that doesn't make sense. 7 is not a physical thing. It's a metaphysical concept. It's not in space. Only something in space can have color. So if you take something not, suppose you say love is blue. I know that we sing the blues. And we can get into metaphors here, but really literally, you say love is, or algebra is heavy. We can do that too. We get into trouble right away with metaphors, because metaphors are crossing, they're called category mistakes. A category mistake is when you think the impossible and put two very alien categories together in one, and you try to make sense, but it doesn't make sense. But so if you say the stone is thinking, no, the stone is a dead thing in one culture. When I arrived at Haverford College in 1968, Wyatt McGaffey, my next door neighbor and next door was an anthropologist in Africa. And he knew I was working on categories and how to predicate and how to make sense of the world and cross worlds. So he approached me immediately and said, Ashok, I go to Africa, I'm trained as a European scientist, and I know what is real in science. And stones aren't thinking, stones aren't conscious. But when I go into the native speaking situation and speak to a native speaker, she would say, this stone is spirit. If you go to India, Shiva is here. And you decorate the stone, you paint it. Shiva is, the spirit is right here. That's a category mistake, it sounds like, from science. But in another world, it makes sense. I'm just trying to point out that when you reorganize the mental space, you get a different world, a different reality. And that's what goes on in this space. And there's all sorts of different worldviews going on here all the time because we predicate differently. And what makes sense in one world doesn't make sense in another. And it has a different structure. I won't go into that now, that gets technical. I'm just giving you some quick hints about the power of this space because we live our lives in this space, in the box of our culture. And it forms a certain worldview, a perspective, or even multiple perspectives. Some of us have multiple worlds that we're living. For example, I might be a practicing Jew or a Christian, and I believe in the Bible. God created the universe, Genesis, right? And I know that to be true. And so that's one me, the biblical believing person. I'm also a scientist, I'm a physicist, and I know from physics that the Big Bang is true. The evidence shows that the universe is expanding, and there must have been a Big Bang. So it's Big Bang that starts the universe, not Genesis. That's a different me. Sub 2. I'm a civic American. And I believe as an American that I should keep my religion out of my politics. Separation of, but that's so difficult because my religion says every moment, every breath, love God with all your heart. How can I cut myself out when I go into the civic space? Doesn't make sense. That hurts. That literally, it is a deep tension for me to be a civic American. That's a different worldview. I'm feeling a lot of stress, obviously, and I'm seeing my therapist. She's a Jungian.
Seeing his therapist.
You know what that means? I've got a male and a female side, the anima and the animus, and I didn't realize I had a feminine. So that I'm really in trouble. I'm really getting stressed out. So I run to my yoga teacher. Yoga teacher saying meditate on Om, and you start to do the Om and the meditation to de-stress. It does help a little bit, but you know, this I'm making a little joke, but you know, to go and to chant Om, you know, and do ego Om, ego yoga, you know, yoga from this space is not yoga, as I'll talk about in a moment. But we live our life that way. We may even go see a tree-hugging person who you know, teaches feng shui. So if I don't organize my furniture, every self is a different self, and they're not talking to one another. That's the trouble. We don't know how to cross worlds. And so we live multiple personalities. We're broken people. And to be a whole person, to be healed, to have well-being and happiness and wholeness, you have to be integral. You have to have a dialogue between these worlds. And this is where the world is. This is the planetary. This is where we're divided. And tremendous violence. 9/11 is a clash of worlds. Islam in the West, for example. Bosnia, Rwanda, East Timor, Pakistan, Middle East, Northern Ireland. All across the planet, all through history, people have been brutalizing each other across our worldviews. Because we privilege our world. This is our reality. You don't mess with your reality. That's all important. What you see through your lens is reality. And if some other challenges that, we interpret the other through our lens. And we don't even realize that's violent. Because when I interpret the other who's different in a different world through my lens, I violate them mentally with my interpretation. I violate the integrity of their otherness. So it takes what I call deep dialogue, not monologue. Most of us live in monologue through our lenses. That means I may be talking to you, but I'm taking you through my lens. And the world is falling apart pretty badly, especially in the global village, because we're different people. Not only in our local civic space, we already have tremendous problems in civic America as a pluralistic culture with different worldviews. How can you have democracy if people can't communicate and talk? So the art of communication requires what I call deep dialogue, real dialogue, which means you have to become an awakened being and step back from privileging your worldview and morph your mind into other ways of thinking, so you dilate your heart and mind so that you can sympathetically respect and communicate with others. And if we can't do that, we're not sustainable. And we can't do that. We're not educated in any of this. And my journey has been to try and decode the different worldviews and ask, how do you move across them? So if you step back, and this is where what I want to open up, and this is where I want to locate a context to think about Swedenborn, because I'm really thrilled to discover that he's speaking from a deeper space. And all of the great geniuses, philosophers, religious founders, were speaking from a deeper space. If you go into the Chinese space and you hear Tao of Lao Tzu, the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching is, the Tao that is named is not the Tao. First axiom, the Tao, namely the ultimate infinite word, the fundamental reality that organizes all, call it Tao. The Tao that is named is not the Tao. Which means what? You can't put Tao in the box. The infinite word cannot be thought in ordinary ways. We're not educated to know that this is a particular technology that is a disaster, according to all of the great teachings. And we don't realize the ego mind, the ego self, the eyes, is here taking a privileged position, seeing herself as an independent point of reference, an independent being, processing himself, herself here too. Because when I think of myself as a subject to predicates. If I ask any of us, tell me about yourself. Who are you? I'd like to learn. You'll start with, well, I was born so-and-so, father, I got my degrees, this is my profession. I'll give you my tape of predications. And that is my ID. That's my identity. That's my being. I am here. And we manufacture ourselves in the box as a bundle of predicates. And all of the great teachers says, don't do that to yourself. Don't objectify. Don't make yourself a thing. Because you dehumanize yourself. You can't be a whole being if you get stuck in the box. And most of us live here. Most of our science and education and culture is taking place in this disaster zone. And I'm going to suggest it's a kind of living hell. And when Swedenborg is talking about heaven and hell, you'll see that it really is very striking what he's talking about. So just to quickly go fast forward, if you go into the Hindu language, the great seers of ancient times saw that if you meditate deeply on ultimate reality, it takes you out of the box where things are broken and divided into Om, or Brahman, or the infinite spirit, the infinite source. And you have a whole powerful language developed, an Om language, which is not the same as Tao, it seems. And if you go into the Buddhist tradition, you may have heard the word shunyata. I'm scribbling here, but shunya means zero, shunyata means zeroness, and Buddha saw that life in the box is suffering. Buddha's awakening. Buddha means the awakened one, and Buddha awakened from the situation. He asked, why do people suffer? In all kinds of ways. Even when they have everything they want, they're suffering. Right? And he got when he woke up, he fought 4 fundamental axioms. That existence is suffering, existential. It has a cause, the ego, that gets attached and fixated. It can be overcome because we have a choice. We don't have to do this. And it can be overcome by a rehabilitation of the mind. That's the 4th noble truth, the Eightfold Path of wisdom and ethics. To rehabilitate the mind in right thinking, right judgment, right action, right speech, every aspect of your life, to rehabilitate yourself, to enter into a profound emptiness of this. Shunyata means emptiness. Real life here is empty of this. You can't use these constructs to put it on that. Certainly not of yourself. So all of Buddhist thinking is getting out of the box. That's all of Hindu thinking. Because if you read the Bhagavad Gita, the fundamental text, where it's a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. Arjuna is over here, and Krishna is the voice of Om. And the divine voice is dialoguing with Arjuna. Arjuna breaks down in a war with his own family and turns to Krishna and says, I can't kill my own people, that can't be right, I'm a warrior. That's my ethics. That's my duty to go into this war. But my relatives on the other side, my teachers, people I grew up with, I can't kill them. Something was piercing him from a higher place, his conscience. And he broke down on the battlefield, he dropped his weapon. That's how it begins, that's chapter 1. It describes how Arjuna breaks down. He has a midlife crisis on the battlefield. His life breaks on, which is always going to happen when you're in ego structure. It's always self-divided, it's always fragmented, it's always dualistic, rather than having coherence, integrity, and unity and well-being. So Krishna teaches Arjuna, wake up Arjuna, I'm going to teach you this grammar. You're ignorant of your own level of consciousness and the technology you're using. Let me give you a quick crash course in ego predication. Then when you get that, that's a prerequisite, I'm going to take you into the real awakening, and that's yoga. And what is yoga? The science of entering into union with Brahman, union with being, union with the infinite. And that's when you become a real warrior. That's when you become a peaceful warrior. That's when you become well-being. So all of Hindu thought is learning the skills of recognizing this and having a choice, and then again, I'll just give you a pattern. Let's switch lenses and go over into the Judaic and Christian tradition very quickly to keep showing this pattern, because I think this is exactly where I find Swedenborg. Because if you go into the Judaic tradition and you understand Yahweh as the infinite spirit, the infinite word, in the biblical tradition, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. And love God with all your heart and mind and soul. Right? That's what does that say? You can't put your ego first if you're going to put God first. First things first is a basic lesson we hear in all life. It's very hard to go from this place to that place. And that's the story of Abraham. I think Swedenborg was right on that. Abraham and Isaac is a paradigm for all human beings. And really, if you read, you could read it literally, but you could read it in a deeper way. And he's always talking about reading it in a deeper way. In his correspondence. His correspondence method, I would suggest, is precisely understanding this logic as a lower logic that doesn't really understand the logic of the logos and the word. And he was decoding the Bible here. The scripture is here. And you can't read the Bible, the infinite word, down in a finite, finitized, constructed, artificial space. It was his great message. So that in Abraham, if you think about the story, God Yahweh commands Abraham, put me first. Abraham, like Arjuna, he's saying, I love my Isaac. More than anything else, I find my son. His agenda was more important. And God was saying, you've got to sacrifice. You've got to give up Isaac. And of course, Abraham takes it literally in this grammar, but God is speaking this grammar. And this grammar says, always put first things first. Put the Logos first. And if you don't, life, all bets are off. And so the idea of faith, the test of Abraham as a prototypical human being, an archetype, was that he finally, in his wrestling match, just as Arjuna, do I put me first and what I want, or do I put the divine will first? And when he saw that he had to give that up, no matter what, test of faith, and faith is not down here, faith is up here. God said, okay, you keep Isaac now. Because it was already done. He let it go. He let his own ego self go. There's a tremendous price from going from this place to that place. And Swedenborg talks about that all through his work. It has to be a sacrifice of your ego, of yourself. And Jesus said you've got to die to be born again. The rite of passage from this to this has to be like that. You've got to be in a way done. You've got to be willing to give up your ID. And then what happens is you discover your true self in a deeper way. That's typically the pathway. And so on. And I would say, suggest that Jesus, Jesus coming after Moses. You know, Moses brought the law. And Jesus was saying we're still not living the law in our hearts. And so Jesus, it seems to me, is exactly the covenant of leaving this place, the place of separation and fragmentation and sin and alienation, to go into the place of communion and reconciliation. So the rite of passage, Jesus is all about going from this, putting the ego first, to putting God first in all things. And I want to talk about that because when we say that Jesus is the Logos made flesh, and Swedenborg is speaking about in that way, I use the word Logos for all of these alternative names. There are many I haven't even touched on. This was just to give you a start. Allah, or even science, energy is the ultimate stuff. I mean, and philosophers have been talking about all kinds of names, primal substance, right? Nature, the infinite, spirit. And give all kinds of names to name what? A fundamental unifying force. Now why is that obsession, so to speak, almost, with all of the different cultures, there's got to be something first? Because just to be a thinking human being, you're already pulled into the source of a light that's surrounding you. You cannot stand outside of the infinite. The infinite force is infinite. And it is the most powerful force, operative on our lives, and detectably so at every moment. And Swedenborg is onto that. As I read his book, at every moment he's saying, God rules in all things. This is the place of love. This is the divine field. And what I found as a young philosopher, realizing this space and being trained in that, not even having this on my screen, it took me about 20 years to reach this point, and then to almost realize, wow, as I was teaching my students how to read the Buddha, and all I knew was this, is trained in this, and I was trying to say, well, the Buddha spoke this way, and Jesus spoke this way, and Krishna spoke, and it wasn't working. Because all of these texts were saying, get out of the box. The truth and the realization is here. And I began to realize there's a profound logic that's missing in humanity that we haven't gotten. So my work as a logician said, what is the common ground across all of our worlds? And so I began over 2 decades, 3 decades to develop the language of Logos. And here's what I basically did, and this is what I'd like to focus on and to elaborate for you and to have you help me in terms of Swedenborg and how to think about him. And that this place, the place of ego life, I'm going to call this ego, the ego sphere. And what I did was to help my students. This really started as a pedagogical device, a teaching device at first, and then I realized there's something really more fundamental. I would say my 40 years of research is summed up in one simple symbol, and it's this. I use double brackets to mark the Logos space. This space of the Logos, so the double brackets is a place in when you're speaking the deep script of the unified awakened mind, the global lens, the global mind, the place that I think Swedenborg is living and thinking out of. And I use single brackets to mark any word uttered in the egosphere. So this is what I'd like to invite you to do. Perhaps you've never done this before in your life.
but realize, am I speaking from the ego voice? Am I speaking this technology? Is this the way my mind is to speak this? Mark it in a single bracket as a quotation mark. I say, okay, I'm aware. When I said me, I'm speaking as an ego voice. And if you can cross into this space and say I, for example, or any word here in the deeper integral logic, the integral space of the logos script, mark that words. If Jesus is speaking, mark it that way. If he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's not speaking ego language. He's a logos speaking. And so, what I'd like to just open up for us and speak sufficient with examples of the difference between life here, which is a hellish kind of life of alienation. This line is very important. It says, in this space, you're cut off from the integral logic and the integral interconnectivity that all of these traditions are saying. What they all see, there's a global consensus here, that reality is a profound, boundless, dynamic, interconnected field where everything is beyond being a fixed object. It's a dynamic energy of interconnectivity. If you understand that science and that logic, and I believe that that's exactly what Swedenborg's journey into the spirit world was all about. He moved from the first layer, he was a brilliant scientist, as you all know, and a creative genius, but he didn't leave his science matured into this. It's not that he broke with that and he went into a deeper way of being a scientist. Because I like to suggest that this technology, and I'm suggesting that if you could understand the double bracket symbolism as marking a deeper logic and technology, can I think in that integral way? It's called, in Buddhist thought, non-duality. And this is called duality. Across the board. The dual space is where this thought space is disconnected from the unified field. The thinker is disconnected from the object of thought. The subject is the thinker, and the object is what we think. We objectify everything in our world, ourselves and others, objectified. So that's a subject-object split. Within this space, the subject and the predicate are separated from each other. So if we say Socrates is wise, then wisdom belongs to Socrates, and Socrates is a being, and wisdom is an attribute. And you look at wisdom, and you can see P is broken into wise and unwise. Good and ungood. It's all polarized, all the way through. The logic of the ego space is a series of separations and polarization. So you might say, if you go into Eastern thought, the fundamental alienation is not only this one, the fall. And you can ask there, what is the fall in the biblical sense? It's being tempted by tasting of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And what is that? You could be like God. You could not being dependent, not being interrelated, separated. Only God can be an infinite, self-constituted being. So the fall may be seen in whatever culture you're in as a severance, a separation, a falling into ego-ing. And so if you want to speak of the sin space, sin is separation from God. And once severed, the ego by its own efforts and will cannot reconstitute itself. And so in the Christian sense, you do need a savior to bridge again. So the Christ is the bridge that is fully God and fully human at the same time, and opens a portal for us to be able to reconcile across this divide. It absolutely is required. Whatever religious language you use, ontologically, scientifically, there's got to be a mediating factor to bring the finite fallen back into relationship with the infinite spirit. And so the Christ becomes a mysterious being that you can't process here, because how can a being be at once infinite and finite at the same time and yet not broken? Be one. That's the magic and mystery of the Christ being, that it is one, unified. Only this logic can handle that. Not this logic. So I'm just giving you a quick flash as to why is ego culture the source of violence and fragmentation and alienation and duality, and why our culture that is made here is going to be fragmented and broken into pieces. Not just in the worlds that I showed before. If you look at education, I teach at one of the best colleges in the country. And Haverford is a Quaker institution, alleges, and we educate the whole person. But students come in there and they sign up for their courses and they take some mathematics and take some physics and some music and some poetry and some philosophy, and all of them are put into compartments.
I teach in the philosophy compartment. Right? Not that we call it a department, but it's a compartment. And if you step out of the compartment, out of your field, out of your box, when I became the first director of the Margaret Guest Center for Cross-Cultural Study of Religion, I was not a religion person, I was a philosopher. What am I doing? It creates a lot of political turbulence to step out of your box. Even in philosophy, which means what? Love of Sophia, the love of wisdom. That's what philosophy is supposed to be. Philosophy means get out of the box, see the whole picture. No, you have to stay in the academic box. It's dangerous to step out. But that's the way education is. It's broken into little fragments. We don't help our students see that if they understood the depth of number and ratio and vibration and frequency and measure, the word reason means ratio. And the Greeks Pythagoreans knew that number was a secret of the universe. And that number had to do with vibration, and vibration is Om. I'm playing a bit, right? The universe is a vibrational frequency that has music, divine music at that level, in profound mathematics and sacred geometry. And we've forgotten all of that. We don't know how to put it together. So we compartmentalize our students, we give them a degree, and say go out into the world. And the world is pretty fragmented and broken. So we're manufacturing and reproducing broken people. And we're taking newborns that have the potential to be humans, which is to be whole, integral, unified being, as Swedenborg saw. And we manufacture them and break them into the boxes of the pieces of information that we manufacture here. So I could go on at great length about why is life in this mental space inherently self-dividing, suffering, alienating, and causing ontological sickness and dis-ease. You can't have well-being. The word, to be well, you've got to be whole. And to be whole, you need an integral technology to put yourself together. And to do that, you have to find a way to be one with the unified field. And fortunately, Logos rules in all things. It took me 10 years to just do that. I would put this here. First I saw that. Students love that. Says Professor Gandhi. It helps me so much to see now that I'm using ego language and to realize that Krishna is speaking from here and God in the scriptures. When God says, when Moses says to God at the burning bush, and God is saying to Moses, go forth and take this. And Moses says, I can't do this. You've got to do it. Whom shall I say sent me? God replies, I am that I am. Now, since we, of course, this is the only language we know, so we say, I am that I am. God said that. It almost sounds like Popeye. I am what I am. but it has a profound, when the infinite word says, I am, that's my name. Right? That's a profound, infinite utterance at a deep level of language, and we don't know how to get it. When Descartes says, I am, he's also crossing into this. So we can make a quick aside now. We brutalize our great teachers all the way through philosophy. Once I began to see this, I looked back and said, my God, when Plato was talking about goodness as the source of all forms and beyond truth and knowledge, and when Socrates saw that knowledge is all ignorance, and he was the wisest of beings, he was beginning to get out of the box. All the great geniuses were beginning to dislodge and see that wisdom is a deeper place. And so I felt that if you're anyone who's read Descartes, and I'd like to make an analogy between Descartes and Swedenborg, because the entire culture reads Descartes here. And Descartes' meditation, if you read his meditation, completely resists putting him back in the box, because his first meditation is saying, there's nothing that I can think in the box that can be true. He proved that. Any predication, being a sentence, may be misunderstood by me, and especially if there's a demon controlling my mind, and that's what this dualism is. It's a demon of separation and dualism and doubt. Descartes was doing a classical meditation where he says, is there anything in my world that I know with absolute certitude? That's absolutely foundational. And he could, so what if I'm dreaming? And quickly that went, waking and dream, he could be all dreaming. Because he couldn't find a way to distinguish. Then he went to a deeper level of mathematics. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Thank God. But even in my dream, 2 plus 2 equals 4. But then he said, well, wait a minute. What if there's a demon controlling my mind and making me think it's true when it's false? I know it sounds paranoid, but that's what he did. And he was right to do that. Because every sentence that we utter in this space, we are separated from
And the thinker is separated from the information, and there's always a possibility of a distorted lens and misinterpretation and falsity and falsifying, and it's not true. There's got to be a more intimate connection between what you know and who you are. And Swedenborg got that principle right on. And so when Descartes saw that, oh my God, there's nothing in my world that I've been educated that is necessarily true. And he dropped his mind. This is getting messy. I can do this really quickly here. Don't forget this, please, because this is really what I'm trying to say. That at first I made the separation between this space and that, and the students would say, Professor Gangley, I see it. But it looks absolutely impossible for me as a student to get to this high place that you're talking about. It's so far away. And then I said, no, wait a minute, that's not what all the traditions teach us differently. Because the logos, the infinite word, surrounds all space. All of the egosphere is surrounded by the logosphere. And that's a very important principle in Swedenborg, when he talks about hell and heaven and the movement and the being in the world and service and all of these things. It's important. So I suggested to my students, if you had to write a symbol of yourself, and it took me 30 years to get to this point, is that you should write this and then write it this way. I call that the principle of relativity. That whatever story you have of who you are more than that. The logos within you, the higher self, is always present already. And the whole task of spiritual, rational awakening and becoming human is being able to step back from the fixity of those informational structures that we process ourselves in the box, step out of the boxes, and allow yourself to be. You're more than any kind of predication or objectification can do. That's the higher awakening. It's always there. Buddha saw that. That the task of enlightenment, the longest, the shortest distance is also the longest distance. From here to there, from here to there, is the most difficult journey for every human being to make. And yet it's the simplest and easiest. Because if you have the courage to step back from the structures that you predicate yourself on, in your rigid worldviews, and allow yourself to show up to yourself and face yourself, that higher self is always there and it's powerful. And it's awaiting our disclosure. And that's a spiritual journey of awakening. And I think that's what Swedenborg's philosophy and teaching is all about. Moving from this space into that. And so as I read Swedenborg, I'm going to give you a few more examples. So in other words, I'm suggesting that when Descartes started to drop his mind and drop his body and drop all of the predications he had of himself, he stripped himself out of this thing and he said, I am. That was an amazing turning point in history, and we blew it because we didn't have this, and we said, Descartes said, I am. Everyone knows what Descartes says, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. Why? Because if I'm thinking, I must be. To be thinking, to predicate on myself, I got to be there to predicate. So even if I doubt, I must be. And that's how he's read. And he completely left the box. They go right back into the box and say, that's what Descartes said. The ultimate truth for human beings is I am, I exist. And I'm suggesting that completely blows the experiment of Descartes, who crossed into the meditative space. Meditative awakening, meditative thinking is where the I am shows up, deeper than any predication. That's exactly what Descartes did for the culture. When he cleansed himself of all of this information, he says, wow, that's frightening. But then he says, I'm here. It was here that he said, I am. And when you say I am here, you're not predicating the way you are. You're not using language. When you speak in this space, and Swedenborg, I think, got this, you're not using language the way you do ordinary literal language, because here, the thinker is over here. Here's consciousness. Here's language, the sentence, and there is a world that it pictures. So if I say, pen is blue, I'm using the sentence, having a thought that says pen is blue, which refers to a state in the world, which is the blue pen. And when these line up and correspond, that's a different meaning of correspondence that you used. When there's a correspondence between my thinking, my sentence, and the world, then we say it's true. Single bracket truth. And I'm suggesting that when Descartes moved to a deeper space, the space of the logos, then, which is non-dual, then the thinker, the language, and being meet at one power point. Every point in the logosphere is so powerful, and Swedenborg got this exactly right. Because when you reach into this space, thank you, when you reach into this space, what's broken here, mind and body, space and time, finite and infinite, God and human. You can just turn it on.
Excuse me.
We can unplug it.
Unplug it.
There, thank you. It has a lot, it's been going into the eye. Now what would you do if it starts up again?
First thing immediately.
I'm trying to give a difference between this space, it separates and fragments and breaks, and how when you cross into this field of the deeper logos language, you come to a very powerful point where all points meet in every one point. When you enter the infinite calculus of the logos, I'm suggesting that when you use the word logos, any name you use, Sophia, I mean feminine, you know, Tao, Om, Allah, Yahweh, whatever the name you use for the ultimate first, I'm using the prototypical name, the generic name logos, not as a replacement. And not to say that Om is the same as Tao. I'm not saying that, because the infinite, the logic of the infinite logos, which is this, the infinite is boundlessly surrounding everything. Nothing can stand outside of the infinite field. So once you begin to realize that there's an infinite force, the logic is very simple and very powerful. There can only be one. Okay, I hope you see that right away. Because if there were more than one infinite, then the other one would defy this one, and limited, it would not be infinite. The logic of the infinite contains a boundless field of unity. But because it's infinitely unifying, so nothing is outside of its jurisdiction, it has infinite diversity within it. It is not the infinite. Most people you think of the infinite or use God. If you put God, the infinite, in this box, it's a disaster. God can't be in the box. The infinite word cannot be downloaded into the ego language. Scripture cannot be read here. And the brilliance of Swedenborg is he went into this divine space as a bold, adventuring scientist who didn't leave science, because this is deeper science. I'm trying to show that. Science has to go here, because this is the place in which deeper knowledge takes place, that overcomes the separation of the subject and the object. Philosophers have not yet been, or scientists have not yet been able to explain how a subject of consciousness can know an object separated from itself. Heisenberg realized that consciousness and the object interact. But that's what this logic is about. This logic is saying everything in the universe is so profoundly interconnected, beyond being a thing, to be an interactive energy field, that the self here and the other here are always I-thou. There's an I-thou, a dialogic relation. To be an I is to be an I-thou. That's the point. There is no I that is not already in relation to the other and to the ecology and to God and to everything around it. That's the deep axiom of all the great traditions. To be is to be interconnected. And the reason for that, here's a logic, and Swedenborg was amazing in how he got the principles one after the other, that if you really begin to see, if you take any point in the logosphere, then it's going to have the infinite within it. And therefore you get what the Quakers saw, and what he saw, there's that of God in every man, every person. That follows, but there's that of the infinite in every being, in everything in the logosphere. Everything is sacred in this space. And when you put everything down here, it's desecrated. If you take a pen and put it here, we know what the pen is, we can predicate it. It's a pen, it's a piece of plastic, it's for writing, and it's disposable, and you throw it out, and it costs so much, you go to the K-bars and so forth, and you toss it. Right? And that's the end of the story. Imagine now that I'm going to perform a miracle. Imagine, behold, a pen. In this level of language. In its logos encodement. It encodes logos. Now think of the pen as mightier than the sword. Think of the pen that encodes all culture. If you found this on Mars, if the probe picked this up and said, Houston, check this out. And you saw this on Mars, you get a thought experiment. You say, oh my God. You know, then you'd see the pen in a different way. You'd be getting closer to seeing the pen here. And saying, Do you realize what this means? If you saw this on Mars, and what it's telling you about the history of evolution and culture and it'll just tell a totally different story than this disposable pen. And we'd overlook it, we throw each other away too like that in this space. Whereas all the great gifted poets and seers recognize it. When you see that, you see what is ultimately sacred because you're seeing a reflection of the divine in every point. Why? It's a simple logic. You can't break off a piece of the infinite, you always get the infinite. It's fractal. It's good science. Not only that, but the laws of nature that apply here can't apply here. That's why scientists are now seeing about non-locality in chaos and complexity. Science is beginning to see you can't do science here. Nature doesn't go into the box. Nature is a non-local field of holistic causation, not linear cause and effect. Those old categories are all crumbling and have crumbled in the 20th century. And Swedenborg got that because he knew this kind of interactive dimension. He knew, for example, when he spoke about the correspondence between spirit and body, mind and body, the mind-body dualism here, the split between the mind and the body is abysmal. It's one of the sufferings we do. We disconnected consciousness from our body. We can't be an integral person. Again, that brokenness I've spoken of. The mind-body plight in ego-minding is just one of the broken pieces that mind and consciousness and body, no one has been able to understand the laws of connectivity between consciousness and body. For 2,500 years, the most gifted minds have still not understood the connection between mind. And it's a miracle that mind and body, consciousness which is not physical and visible, can move matter. If I move that plaque from the wall from here, and just by an act of thought, you would probably get spooked. But just do another thought experiment. Here's an object right here. It's my arm. And by an act of thought, I'm going to move this piece of matter. We do this all the time. I'm moving my body. Consciousness is moving matter. No one has figured out how it is. You can't understand the laws of... So mind-body medicine is not here. Mind-body medicine, the revolution in medicine, to realize this integral, complementary, alternative medicine that could put together acupuncture and Ayurvedic and allopathic, good old science, and x-rays and surgery, all that's part of it. Right? But how do you find integral healing for the whole person? It's not here. So mind-body medicine is trying to put a mind-body, one concept. This is what happens when you cross language from the broken, separated pieces into the integral space. What is broken here has to be hyphenated there. So if you have space and time here that are separated, as they were for Newton, and Einstein said in his relativity, the space-time continuum. E equals mc squared. Mass and energy convert. He was already knocking on the door, just at the tip of the iceberg. So it's not just space and time, it's space, time, mind, body. I mean, it just is unbroken. Every word, here's the point. The secret of this grammar, this is what I've worked on for 30 years. The secret of this grammar, and we don't have literacy in it, even though all our great teachers are speaking that grammar, and Swedenborg is a pioneer here, is that every concept encodes every other concept, just as the pen encodes the entire field, just as each of us encodes the entire field. Each human being, each I am, understood as a PowerPoint, is a miracle of a sacred being that reflects the entire field within it. That's the logic of being sacred. So that Swedenborg was tapping that logic when he talks about, he says there's a deeper way. So I would suggest that when he was decoding the Bible and trying to give us the deeper meanings and the